Idealism in movies can be absolutely infuriating. We are bombarded with characters who refuse to bend, who hold on to their principles with a death grip, as if sheer willpower alone can solve all problems. Batman's obsession with his no-kill rule, Professor X's desperate plea for peace with humanity, or Captain America's moral grandstanding. These characters are celebrated for standing up for what's right, but sometimes it's hard not to wonder if they are just making things worse. Why are we so quick to praise these stubborn idealists when in reality, their rigid morality will drive most of us insane? The truth is, the idealism that seems so noble on screen can become unbearable when you really start to unpack it, revealing not just the cracks, but the outright flaws. Today, I'm going to show you why these supposedly virtuous characters might not be the heroes we think they are. Batman, a symbol of justice in Gotham City, is the epitome of moral absolutism. His unwavering code against killing, regardless of the circumstances, creates a rigid line between right and wrong that can appear admirable on the surface, but is often frustrating in practice. In countless situations, Batman chooses to capture and imprison some of the most extreme criminals rather than end their threat for good, even when these criminals, like the Joker, have repeatedly proven that they will continue to harm innocent people. His refusal to take a life, even at the expense of future victims, is rooted in an idealistic belief that taking a life will make him no better than the criminals he fights. Yet, this stance becomes insufferable when it leads to the continuous escape and recapture of villains, resulting in more death and chaos. I've actually made a video going more in-depth into the flaws of Batman's ideals of not killing. You can check it out right here. Now, this isn't something unique to Batman. Other superheroes like Superman and Captain America are equally frustrating idealists, but none of them come close to this next person. Professor Charles Xavier from the X-Men series is another example of an idealist who becomes difficult to tolerate. He dreams of a world where mutants and humans coexist peacefully and consistently seeks to resolve conflicts with his rival Magneto and other anti-mutant forces through diplomacy and understanding. While his vision of unity is noble, it is also impractical and at times unrealistic. Time and again, Xavier's idealism blinds him to the harsh realities that mutants face: systematic persecution, fear, and violent discrimination. Despite numerous betrayals and instances where his pacifist approach fails, Xavier clings to the belief that reason will ultimately prevail. Charles Xavier is so blind to reality that he repeatedly treats the lives of his X-Men, all in a relentless effort to beg for humanity's tolerance of mutant kind. Some people might continue to defend him, arguing that his intentions are noble, but the fact remains, he sacrifices his X-Men over and over again, with no real progress in human-mutant relations. It's frankly infuriating and illustrates two things. Either Xavier is incredibly naive, or he clings to a sense of moral superiority that drives him to pursue the same failed strategy regardless of the cost. This kind of idealism, while commendable in theory, borders on naive optimism. It becomes particularly frustrating when his refusal to adapt to a more pragmatic approach endangers not only himself but also his students and fellow mutants. Xavier's belief in the inherent goodness of humanity and the power of dialogue may make him a beacon of hope, but his reluctance to acknowledge that some conflicts require more than words makes him an insufferable idealist. It reveals a key flaw in idealism itself. By refusing to compromise, idealists can be ineffective and even harmful to the very causes they aim to protect. William Wallace is hailed as a martyr for freedom, a hero who stands for Scotland against oppression. But let's take a moment to really dissect this so-called heroism. Wallace's unwavering commitment to his ideals is downright infuriating. He believes in fighting for freedom at any cost, but what he doesn't seem to grasp is that this blind ambition leads to a bloodbath. Instead of seeking strategic alliances or negotiating for a better future, he charges headfirst into battle, willing to sacrifice not just his life, but the lives of countless others for an ideal. He is willing to watch countless people die, see families torn apart, and plunge entire communities into chaos just to maintain this idealistic stance. The man embodies a kind of reckless idealism that borders on stupidity. It's like he's so caught up in his romantic vision of heroism that he forgets the very real consequences of his actions. Sure, we can admire his passion and want for freedom, but let's be real. His refusal to compromise turns him into a destructive force rather than a unifying one. The relentless pursuit of this noble cause leads to chaos and despair, leaving families torn apart and communities in ruin. Is it really bravery to lead your people into a fight you know they can't win? At what point does idealism become a burden rather than a gift? Wallace isn't just a martyr, he's an insufferable dreamer whose actions, fueled by an unrealistic sense of honor, leave a trail of destruction in their wake. Instead of inspiring a movement, he becomes the very catalyst for more violence, showing that sometimes the idealist path is the worst one to take. It's hard to keep cheering for someone who seems more in love with the idea of martyrdom than with actually improving anyone's lives. Atticus Finch is often idolized as the epitome of moral integrity, a steadfast champion of justice in a world marked by racism and prejudice. But here is the harsh truth. His idealism is not only naive, it's annoying. Atticus believes that simply doing what is right will lead to justice, but the reality is much more complicated. His unwavering commitment to his principles blinds him to the systemic injustices that exist around him. He's a good man, yes, but his good intentions aren't enough to challenge deeply entrenched societal norms. In a world where the scales of justice are rigged against the oppressed, his noble actions feel like a drop in the ocean. He holds on to this illusion that his moral stance will somehow educate the ignorant and bring about change. But let's face it, it often just comes across as self-righteousness. Watching him preach his ideals while knowing that the people around him are largely indifferent to his struggles is maddening. The real world doesn't work that way, and his unwillingness to get his hands dirty or go beyond the proper channels leaves him spinning his wheels. It's frustrating to watch him throw his weight behind a hopeless cause without considering strategies that might have a real impact. His idealism feels more like stubbornness, a refusal to see that the world is much darker and more complex than his neat little moral code allows. Atticus seems to think that simply presenting the truth will lead to enlightenment, but that's a recipe for disappointment. The fact that he refuses to adapt his strategy or engage with the complexities of the system makes his idealism not just infuriating, but also irresponsible. His rigid moral code ultimately leaves his family and community exposed to the very prejudices he claims to fight against, illustrating how idealism, when disconnected from reality, can be a dangerous thing. His approach, though well-intentioned, is naive, as it underestimates the depth of societal racism and the unwillingness of the community to change. His belief that presenting a compelling legal case can sway deeply ingrained prejudices is overly optimistic, bordering on wishful thinking. While Finch's moral stance provides a model of ethical behavior, it also highlights the limits of idealism when confronted with the harsh realities of systemic injustice. And then we have John Keating, the charismatic teacher who preaches the mantra of carpe diem and encourages his students to live authentically. Sounds great, right? Wrong. On the surface, his teachings seem profound, yet they often teeter on the edge of recklessness. Keating romanticizes the idea of seizing the day, but what he fails to recognize is that real life is filled with consequences, and not every decision should be made on impulse. His idealism, while invigorating, often lacks the practical grounding that his students desperately need. He inspires them to think outside the box and challenge societal norms, which is admirable, but he does so without preparing them for the backlash. Encouraging a group of impressionable teenagers to throw caution to the wind is a dangerous game. When the students take his advice too far, it leads to tragic outcomes. Sure, it's easy to stand on desks and preach nonconformity when you don't have to deal with the fallout. But what about the students he pushes to rebel without equipping them to face the real consequences? What about the fact that his romanticized ideals lead to real-world tragedy? Keating gets to be the cool teacher with his unrelenting ideals, while his students are the ones who pay the price for his reckless encouragement. He is a man who shoves others into the deep end of idealism without even checking if they know how to swim. His insistence on non-conformity becomes less a call to action and more of a reckless abandonment of responsibility. In the end, Keating may be the cool, inspiring teacher, but his influence leads to heartbreak and loss. He advocates for ideals that, while beautiful in theory, prove to be utterly impractical in the real world. It's easy to champion idealism when you are not the one facing the harsh realities of life. Keating's philosophy, while motivating, ultimately showcases how dangerous unchecked idealism can be when it's not coupled with a sense of responsibility. But despite all of this, audiences still flock to stories about idealists. So it begs the question, why? The answer lies in the comfort and reassurance that idealist characters provide. In movies, we know that the story will bend to the will of the idealist, ensuring a happy ending. Captain America's moral rigidity will ultimately be vindicated. Superman's unyielding goodness will eventually save the day. In fiction, idealism isn't a gamble, it's a promise. We love idealist characters because they offer us a sense of moral clarity and hope, especially in a world where such qualities often feel lacking. There's a certain escapism in watching a character who remains true to their principles even when faced with impossible choices. They become a stand-in for the world as we wish it could be, one where doing the right thing always works out, and where idealism is rewarded rather than punished. But this is exactly where the problem lies. Fiction can afford to simplify complex issues, while reality cannot. When we shift from the screen to real life, we see how impractical and even harmful idealism can be. In the real world, rigid adherence to principles without consideration for the complexities of a situation can lead to negative consequences. Let's take a closer look at real-life examples where idealism falls short. Consider some environmental movements that demand an immediate end to fossil fuel use without a phased approach. While their intentions are undeniably good, such a rigid stance can alienate potential allies and ignore the economic realities that make a gradual transition to sustainable energy more feasible. Idealism even extends into our relationships and personal lives, where people often hold rigid expectations for the perfect partner. Many have a checklist of traits their partner must meet, whether it's height, weight, income, or even sexual history. This pursuit of perfection sets unrealistic standards, often leading to disappointment when reality doesn't measure up. By clinging to these idealized traits, people overlook the complexities and imperfections that make relationships genuinely meaningful. It's yet another example of how idealism can not only be insufferable, but also self-defeating, as it blinds us to the beauty of accepting real, imperfect human connections. Another example will be in the workplace and business. We have idealistic business leaders who refuse to adapt to changing market conditions, often finding themselves struggling. Take the example of Blockbuster, which clung to its traditional business model despite the rise of streaming services like Netflix. Their refusal to deviate from an idealized vision of video rental stores led to their downfall. In fiction, we can afford to indulge in the fantasy of idealism, where moral purity is always rewarded and doing the right thing is always possible. But in real life, idealism can often be insufferable, impractical, and even harmful. It's not the unyielding adherence to principles that makes us better, but rather the ability to navigate the complexities of life, to find a balance between idealism and pragmatism. None of this is to say that idealism should be dismissed entirely. Far from it. Idealism has a place in storytelling, in politics, in activisms, and even in our personal lives, but it needs to be balanced with realism to be truly effective. Idealist characters can inspire us to hold on to our values and believe in something greater than ourselves. However, they must also grow, adapt, and recognize the gray areas of life to feel truly human. The world isn't black and white, and the insistence on treating it as such is stupid, and in the context of fiction, can make idealist characters not just insufferable, but sometimes detrimental to the very causes they aim to protect. Ultimately, the insufferability of idealist characters arises not from their lack of good intentions, but from the unrealistic expectations they place on themselves and others. While their ideals shine brightly on the silver screen, their uncompromising nature would likely falter under the weight of the world's harsh realities. The paradox remains. We love idealism in movies because it offers an escape from the compromises of real life, but it is precisely those compromises that make living in the real world possible. That's just my opinion, anyways.